Okay, I am live. Welcome everyone to the Burning Archive YouTube live stream on Tuesday, the 30th of May 2023. This live stream is about India and Australia. Are we partners for a free and fair and multipolar world, or are we just occasional friends when Narendra Modi comes to visit in a big stadium at Homebush in Sydney, where our Prime Minister, Australia's Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, called Narendra Modi the boss after Bruce Springsteen. It's a pity he couldn't come up with a more culturally appropriate reference, but it certainly seemed that Narendra Modi enjoyed it. If you haven't been to my channel before, the Burning Archive YouTube channel is where I talk about history and geopolitics, world affairs and culture. And I try to connect the stories of today's ever-changing, conflict-ridden, multipolar world with some deeper stories, not so much the flim-flam you get in the media, in the news every night on the television or on the internet or on Twitter, but rather some of the deeper stories of history, some of the deeper cultural heritage of the world as it's handed down to us in literature and other sources. And India is one of the greatest and most important and most precious holders of that cultural heritage of the world, even though dear old Britain has perhaps stolen a few things from India over the years, but still it is very much part of the living heritage of the multipolar world, both in its concept of what a multipolar world can be, and its traditions, of its deep religious traditions, its deep cultural traditions, its deep traditions of responsible statecraft, its deep democratic traditions and heritage. As I've said on an earlier podcast, India is the mother of democracy, describes itself as the mother of democracy, and has a fairly good claim for that. It's not an exclusive claim, but it is certainly an important claim for that. So thanks for joining me on the live stream. Do pop in a chat if you like, or if you're watching the live stream replay subsequently, send us a comment and I'll respond to your comments and chats along the way or in subsequent videos. Because I'm really interested, particularly what viewers from India have to say about how you see the sort of changing role of India in the multipolar world, and whether Australia really even figures as a significant player in your sense of where India's future might lie in the multipolar world. Did you notice that Albo called Modi Albo is the nickname, the Australian nickname for Anthony Albanese? Did you notice that Albo called Modi the boss? Or was it something that just passed you by, where you focused on much more important things, such as the opening of the splendid and beautiful new parliament building in India, and some of the beautiful ceremonies, the beautiful crafts, the beautiful art, and the occasional controversy around that with semi-boycott by some of the, well, perhaps half-hearted boycott by some of the opposition politicians. So today I really want to focus on this question of India and Australia's relationship in diplomacy and in the multipolar world, and whether we could actually be better friends, better partners, not just within the Quad, not just within the British Commonwealth, not just within the American Empire, but in a genuinely free and fair, open, multipolar world in which we are not allies, we are not vassals, we are not subservient one to the other or to other great powers. We're not serving the interests of America or Britain. We are genuinely, both India and Australia, pursuing our own independent national interest, our own independent role, our own independent cultural expression within a free and fair multipolar world. What is India's role in the multipolar world, and what are the implications of that for Australia? Do send us in any chats or comments that you might have. One of the benefits, I mean, I'm only just starting out on live streaming, and I don't pretend to have an enormous audience on the live streaming at the moment. So if you are there and watching, you can very much throw in a question if you wish. So what is India's role in the multipolar world? Is Narendra Modi more than, as Albo says, the boss? Is India more than, as Narendra Modi says, the voice of the global south? Is India, in fact, now the leader of the free and fair world? And if that is so, what does America, splendid in its impunity, dropping bombs all over the world and then complaining about anyone who dares fight back, and with Senator Lindsey Graham disgracing himself with his abhorrent comments about smirking about dying Russians and it being the best investment that America has ever made. Truly appalling comments, and I hope that the arrest warrant that has been issued for Senator Graham is actually executed. That would be quite a form of justice. But anyhow, let's not get diverted onto Russia and Ukraine and American matters. What should Australia do? Well, I mean, there's a big question about what America is doing, and there's certainly some signs that it doesn't seem all that happy, frankly, about India asserting a greater leadership role in the international community. But what should Australia do about it? Should we back India's push to join the United Nations Security Council, and more than just that, to reform fundamentally both the Security Council and its operational sort of processes, the way the veto works, and how it works with the United Nations General Assembly? Should we back India's push on behalf of the global South to make the United Nations a much more effective international institution, one where the whole world feels it is the forum in which it should go to resolve big issues of peace, security, and relationships between nations, civilizations, cultures, and not just a platform, one more platform out of New York for Western diplomatic posturing. Should Australia be humble enough to learn from India? Indeed, should Australia learn from India in terms of its foreign policy? Learn from the leadership of people like Narendra Modi and the outstanding External Affairs Minister of India, Dr. S. Jaishankar. Should Australia rather be humble enough to pivot to Delhi and away from Washington. And this is not just a question for leaders or, foreign ministers or diplomats or, the generals or people in think tanks, the national security community, so-called, the people inside the great big blob of the elite. It is a question for, at a personal level, for you and for me, whether you're in India, whether you're in Australia, whether you're in another country altogether, and are curious about the changing role of India and Australia in the world. What can we do to adapt to these changing times, to this changing multipolar world, where India has surpassed in many ways its old imperial oppressor, Britain? How can we refocus our attention? What different newspapers should we read? How should we change our sources of information, our cultural priorities, and our basic concerns? Should we turn off Netflix and start reading the Mahabharata? I should really have got my copy to hand. Where is it gone? There we go. Totally fine book that I'm rereading, and highly recommend to any viewers of the Burning Archive YouTube channel to read the great piece of both art and philosophy and a tradition of statecraft, the Mahabharata. So should we turn off Netflix and read the great Mahabharata? Should we turn off CNN and Jake Tapper or Sarah Ferguson from the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, or even the huge number of American, British, European independent news channels out there, great channels, many of which I watch quite closely, but which retain this excessive focus on the issues of America and Britain and Europe, and not enough focus on the growing power centres of the new multipolar world like India. Should we start watching Indian news channels? Should we start watching Palki Sharma, the excellent host of First Post, and previously I think on World is One News? Should we start watching Abhijit Chavda, the truly fantastic and fascinating, I think he's some kind of scientist, to be honest, but he has a very wide-ranging and very well-informed discussion of geopolitics, history and science on his channel? Or should we watch, if I can just find it, not this one, should we watch should we watch Republic World, where the absolutely superb Arnab Goswami talks about Indian politics and hosts these Arnab's debates that you can see there, which put Australian and American and British television channels, frankly, to shame. They are far more interesting and lively and educated and at a level of thinking and evidence and argumentation that is well beyond most of what you see on the Australian or British or American mainstream media. Arnab Goswami is absolutely fantastic, and some of the debates that he's had where he's challenged very distinguished American foreign policy scholars, and those foreign policy scholars have kind of walked out of the studio, whether they acknowledge it or not, with their tail between their legs. We should also be celebrating India's new home of democracy and the exquisite symbols and art and rituals and philosophy embedded in the construction of that building. And the moving, living heritage of so many cultural traditions that were included within the ceremony for the new Parliament building in India, which only happened in the last day or so. We shouldn't smear and slur India's reasonable claim to be the mother of democracy, or perhaps one of the many parents of democracy, to be one source of the cultural traditions of democratic processes and responsible statecraft. And we should go further than just performing for the crowd like Albo and getting everyone excited by calling Modi the boss. We should actually be proposing something. That is, Australia should be proposing something real in the diplomatic forums of the world, not just doing America's bidding, but really backing the India's proposals to reform the United Nations, and in particular the United Nations Security Council, so it is no longer a NATO-dominated committee. I think we should, and I think this represents part of India's new soft power in the world. And I think it, and I know I have at least some viewers of the channel who are from India. I think it's important for those Indian audiences too to realise that, to just stopping something on the on one of the other screens there. So I really think it's important for Indian viewers, Indian audiences, to realise that a lot of people in the West are getting rather sick of the way the West behaves on the international stage. There's a lot of disenchantment with governing the world the American way. That's a phrase that's used by the historian Mark Mazower in his book Governing the World, The History of an Idea, which is about the history of world government and the United Nations in particular. And I talked about it in my most recent podcast, episode 102, which was talking about Narendra Modi's recent speeches in Sydney and Port Moresby and Hiroshima, and how they express India's agenda for reform of the United Nations, its agenda to be the leader of the free and fair world, or at least the voice of the global South, and and how that relates to some of the deep cultural traditions of India. Not just Hindu nationalism, but indeed Narendra Modi evokes the words, or cites the words of the Lord Buddha in support of the different approach to diplomacy that India proposes. So I think a lot of people in the West are looking to India for a different way, are hoping India's growing wealth, it's growing soft power, it's growing diplomatic skill, or it's long established but increasingly assertive diplomatic skill can actually start winning a few of these big international arguments, these big international negotiations over the world order. So yeah, there's a lot of disenchantment with governing the world the American way, and a lot of people want to hear India as the voice of the global South. Excuse me. As the great Bharat, as one of the leading great states of diplomacy and dialogue, as the source of many indeed, of the deepest cultural traditions we know. India is the home of, I think, at least 4 of the major religions of the world. Now, of course, there are plenty of haters. I saw just earlier today on the Twitter stream of Professor Salvatore Babones, the eminent, I guess, Indian or Australian American political sociologist. He's an American by, I think, birth and perhaps even by citizenship, and he works and lives in Australia, but he has, over the last couple of years, become quite a significant commentator on Indian affairs, and he even got to meet Narendra Modi when Narendra Modi came to Sydney last week. And regrettably, there was, I think, a student group at Sydney University who sent out some protest message about Narendra Modi and the Vice-Chancellor of Sydney University permitting Narendra Modi to meet with anyone at all, I guess, in Australia, that was full of this kind of vile language, this hatred towards Hinduism and to India and to Narendra Modi, and a whole lot of really quite false accusations about fascism and communal violence and discrimination and a whole series of other things. Now, don't get me wrong, one has to be realistic about what India can do. It still has a lot of poverty and it has a lot of challenges, but it is the world's largest democracy. It is perhaps one of the most successful multicultural societies on earth. I think there are 23 or something like that languages sort of enshrined as official languages in the Indian constitution. Someone should tell Volodymyr Zelensky that, and maybe he could allow people to speak Russian in Ukraine again. So it has a lot of challenges, but it has extraordinarily successfully dealt with many of those challenges. So what do you think? If you're watching either live or on the replay, send us a comment and a chat, and I'll sort of come back to your comments and chats in future live streams. I'd be really, really interested in particular to hear what people in India have to say about this. Are you looking for more involvement or more more effective partnership from places like Australia? Are you happy to be sort of flattered and patted on the head by Joe Biden or Anthony Albanese or whoever, and or do you actually want Australia or other Western countries, because after all, Australia is a pretty small place in terms of population size, do you want those countries to do something much more substantial to advance India's agenda on the international stage? Interestingly, Dr. S. Jaishankar, who's the External Affairs Minister of India, has written a book in the last couple of years called The Indian Way, how India can navigate its way in the new multipolar world. And it's interesting how he sort of looks at that world stage and the changing world scene. He talks about multipolarity being the natural state of the world. There's no tolerance. Well, there's maybe some tolerance, but there's no kowtowing to the American liberal rules-based order. And I found it interesting where he positioned Australia in his book. He says about the international environment that if the landscape looks very different today, so do India's key partners. The relevance of the US or China is far more than any time earlier. The Russian relationship may have defied odds by remaining incredibly steady, even more so and perhaps stronger still after the American diplomatic and economic pressure after the invasion of Ukraine. But it is the exception, not the rule. Japan has now become an important factor in our calculations. The rediscovery of Europe is also underway, with France now a critical strategic partner. The Gulf has been bridged in an extraordinarily effective manner. ASEAN has grown closer, and Australia's relevance is more apparent. A strong sense of the extended neighbourhood is apparent. Africa is the focus of development assistance and opening of new embassies, and as evident from diplomatic activities, our outreach extends from South America and the Caribbean to the South Pacific and the Baltics. And indeed, Narendra Modi went to the South Pacific immediately before his visit to Sydney. And one of the sort of YouTube news sources that I mentioned earlier, Abhijit Chavda, has a very interesting video on that whole issue, which I may or may not be able to find quickly. Just bear with me one sec. Aha, here we are. And I'm not going to play this here, but we'll just get rid of the ad. USA interrupts PM Modi's visit to Papua New Guinea will disfavour China. Very interesting video, and if you do get a chance, I do recommend you have a look at that. But what Abhijit Chavda basically says is that in the weeks before Joe Biden cancelled his participation in the Quad, or said he cancelled his trip to Papua New Guinea and to Australia, and then asked Anthony Albanese as chair to cancel the Quad, or instructed him perhaps. Joe Biden kind of gate crashed this very important diplomatic and business South Pacific or Pacific Island and India forum that was the Indian government with Narendra Modi and Dr. Jaishankar had put a lot of work in and had organised a big business delegation. But Joe Biden decided he wanted to arrive in Papua New Guinea and instructed the Australian and New Zealand Prime Ministers to do the same for just 3 hours in order to sort of, pressure Papua New Guinea to sign a defence agreement. And but then, after stuffing up everyone's plans, forcing a huge Indian business delegation to not go to Papua New Guinea to discuss investment in a poor, underdeveloped nation that is also resource rich, Joe Biden then sort of said, I can't be bothered going to the South Pacific after all because I've got to have a negotiation about my credit card limit in the United States. And I think probably Papua New Guinea were a little bit put out, and it was interesting, in fact, how both the Papua New Guinea Prime Minister spoke with a lot of respect towards the Indian Prime Minister and recognised Narendra Modi's role as the voice of the global South. So the Pacific is an important area for Indian diplomacy. Russia, China, Europe, America, Latin America, Africa is. And Australia's relevance is increasingly apparent. Perhaps not the strongest affirmation of the Australian-Indian partnership, but perhaps a appropriate recognition that we are an important cog, but not the prime cog of that relationship. Tell me what you think with a comment or a chat if you're watching. Let me also say, if I just quickly adjust something here, let me also say that I think on the channel I'm going to continue to address issues about India's history and culture and its role in the multipolar world. And it's something I've really been doing since like about January 2023 for the last, whatever that is, 4 or 5 months. And I think I've done now 6 episodes of the podcast or a YouTube video on issues to do with India, including like last Friday I did my podcast, which is also on the YouTube channel, about Modi in Sydney and the Indian way to reform the United Nations. And that's a really great podcast, I think, that also talks about why, after all, why is India not got a permanent seat on the United Nations Security Council? It's the world's largest democracy. It's now the world's largest, most populous country. It is, has all those traditions of peace and non-violence. It's the home of 4 of the religions of the world, including, Buddhism and Jainism and it's very, very strong traditions of peace. It is the traditional, leader of the non-aligned movement during the Cold War. And so its moral and historical and cultural claim to be on the United Nations Security Council is very, very strong. And I sort of go into the history about that. So you might want to check that out either on a podcast platform or on the YouTube channel. It's just in my podcast playlist. And I've also done a podcast and YouTube video on India as the mother of democracy. Why and how? What's the basis for India claiming that it is the mother of democracy? I've done a podcast that looks a little bit more in more detail about Dr. S.J. Shanker's book, The Indian Way, and how it is charting a new course in foreign policy, and how, in a way, India is leading the world in adapting to a changing multipolar reality, the world's return to its natural multipolar state. I've done a video on, 2 videos in fact, on the movie RRR. I'm not very good at saying RRR, but RRR, which I think stands for Resist, Revolt, and Rise, Resist and Revolt, I think, about how it shows India is becoming, it demonstrates India's new soft power and how India is becoming a major world power. And also I sort of do a little video that sort of looks right at the end, without any spoilers, right at the end of the film RRR, there is a set of iconic figures from Indian history, most of whom are people who, you know, are like the Western versions of Indian history, very much focus on Gandhi and all that sort of thing. And, you know, the kind Brits sort of handing back India. But these figures are among the people who resisted and sometimes fought fire with fire, so to speak, the rather cruel and oppressive rule of the British Empire. And then finally, I have also done a podcast and a video about how India is becoming the real leader of the free and fair world, and that looked in particular at little brain phase there at the Voice of the Global South conference that India convened earlier this year as part of its presidency of the G20. India is the president of the G20 this year, and it is very cleverly orchestrating diplomatic opinion to express those kind of views. So I think I've also addressed India's rather admirable diplomacy, its position of neutrality, extensively in my discussion of the Russia and Ukraine war, and I've done a lot of podcasts on that. So I've even actually considered doing a series of podcasts on the history of India, and have started making my way through a few books, including the currently famous / controversial This is Bharat, and also this fascinating book, India in the Persianate Age, 1000 to 1765, by Richard Eaton. And I may well return to that on the channel. So if you are interested in my views on Indian history, I see Adventure Time saying there that Abhi Chavda Palki Sharma is good, but that Republic World is a shouting match. And I know what you mean. It can be a shouting match. But sometimes it can be a very enjoyable to watch shouting match. I don't know. I guess it depends on your thing. I guess what I sort of really liked about Arnab Goswami is his preparedness to challenge some of the very complacent sort of views of some of the kind of Western intellectuals who sort of come come on his show and just assume that they'll sort of tell Indians what they should do in the world. But that's a fair comment, and I'm glad you like Abhijit Shabda and Palki Sharma. I hope I'm saying their names reasonably well. Anyhow, so there's some of the things I've done on India. But then the other question, I guess, is, well, if Australia, this whole question of what should Australia do beyond just, call Narendra Modi the boss and sort of feel good about themselves. Oh, I see a question there from Adventure Time. Do you think Australia should become a republic? Union Jack in Australian flag looks like an outpost of the former British Empire. Well, that's a good question. I think probably, well, I've got two views around that. I think yes, in the sense that we could let go of the imperial heritage, and in a way, India represents a strong example in that way. The other thing, though, is like if we are going to go to all the trouble to change from, a former British constitutional monarchy to a republic, wouldn't there needs to be some positive change in the nature of the republic itself? Like the actual nature of the political institutions should change. And it's not just changing who's the ceremonial head of government or the flag and that sort of thing. I think we should make a change to let go of some of those symbols, but also to move forward in a constructive way to better political institutions. And wow, we could certainly improve our political institutions. And I think a lot of the debate about the Republic in Australia at the moment tends to just be a kind of, that sort of nationalist kind of thing, or let's change the symbols because, it's an offence to Australian pride, rather than the constructive, like this is the positive path we're choosing with a different political system. And way back, I don't know, whenever it was, there was a big debate, a vote on the Republic, and I think that was the issue it sort of fell apart on, because there was not really agreement to what the positive change people were moving to. There was a whole debate around what should be the powers of a new president as opposed to a constitutional monarch. So, great question, Adventure Time, and let us know what country you're from, Adventure Time, as well, because it's also interesting to think about what the perception of Australia is in the outside world, and how some of those things affect things. And I guess the other thing is there is a hot debate at the moment in Australia about the loyalty of many political leaders and many of the elites, let's say, to the American alliance. There's a very heated debate where perhaps the majority is pro-America or pro-status quo, but there are some increasingly strong advocates of, detaching a bit from the American empire. And in a way, that's what I mean by Australia should pivot from Washington to Delhi. It's sort of like using Barack Obama's old phrase that that America should pivot from Europe or the Middle East to Asia, and Australia, I think, should pivot from Washington and the Atlantic world preoccupation with, American politics and, standing with Ukraine and all that sort of thing, and focus much more on India, including the countries of Asia or Eurasia that represent, a huge proportion of the world and a huge proportion of the world's cultural traditions as well. But if we're going to do that, how? I mean, that's the question, isn't it? Like, it's all very well to just, talk about that, but how practically, given the very strong influence of Americans and their strong traditional symbolic attachment of Australia to the British Empire, how can Australia stand on its own 2 feet and assert a more independent foreign policy in a truly multipolar world? I think we can do that. I think we can pivot to Delhi and away from Washington. But I don't think we need to do this as a vassal. We don't need to switch from being, a British colony to an American sub-imperial power to then becoming some sort of, hanger-on to a new great India. But we should learn from India. We should be humble enough to learn from India how to be a sovereign democracy and an assertive great middle power, or even in India's state, an assertive great power in the multipolar world. I've even actually prepared 10 little draft 10-point plan for Australia to pivot from the United States to India. And before I do that, I might just pause to see if there are any other questions there from the chat, and then I'll sort of throw out my 10-point plan for the 10-point plan for India, for Australia. I will let me try to explain this properly. I will explain my 10-point plan for Australia to pivot from America to India in its foreign policy, become a truly independent country in a multipolar world, and I will then perhaps sort of check if there are any more questions and wrap up the live stream, looking for going for about 60 minutes today. So if you do have any more questions, do let us know. Okay, this is my 10-point plan for Australia to pivot from the United States to India, from Washington to Delhi, and I might do a subsequent video that just expands on these 10 points, but let's listen. Let's think about what they are. So point number 1 is that we should think deeply about the multipolar world as it is. We should follow the example of India and do, as I think Dr. S.J. Shankar described in his book, The Indian Way, a deep audit of Australian foreign policy to let go of some of the old ideas that still inform Australian foreign policy and think through the realities of the intricate, dynamic, multipolar world in which we have no permanent friends, but we have enduring interests for both the global good and the national for the nation. Second point is, I think we should abandon the concept of the Indo-Pacific. The Indo-Pacific concept, which is a strange concept, but it's at the heart of the Australian and American strategic thinking. The Indo-Pacific is not really the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. It is a much more limited concept. It doesn't include China. It doesn't include Russia, even though they are both very significant Pacific powers. It doesn't include the east coast of Africa, even though that's part of the Indian Ocean. It is, as I think, as a strategic concept, quite incoherent, and one that has a complicated history. But I think it also gets in the way of us really seeing where we are in the world and where our neighbours and potential partners are in the world. The Indo-Pacific has become really a way for America to contain China, to try to enlist India in the old, Anglo-American world empire, to contain China, to contain Russia. It's almost a synonym for America's Eastern Empire, just as the Euro-Atlantic region is its Western Empire. And I think Australia would do well to, following its deep consideration of what the real multipolar world looks like, abandon the Indo-Pacific concept and look at where we and what we really are in the world, a great trading nation at the very south-east tip of coastal Eurasia. The third point is to prepare our elites and intelligentsia for the fall of the Anglo-American ascendancy. The British historian of Russia, Dominic Leven, has made the point that the world is approaching a decisive point in history. For 300 years, the world has been dominated by Anglo-American powers, first Britain and now America. And Australia's entire foreign policy and post-settlement cultural history has been in this Anglophone world, with all the implications for language, culture, political traditions, civilizational connections, and people ties. It is this Anglophone world that created the idea of the West. It's the same Anglophone world that kept India in chains for 200 years and looted the Kohinoor diamond from India. And it is the world that is ending. And when it ends, it means we need to be open to much more civilizational diversity, much more diversity of language and culture and values and cultural expression and institutional forms of different societies. We need to stop trying to fit the whole world into a Western intellectual model. The fourth point in my plan for Australia to pivot from Washington to Delhi is that we should change our participation in the Quad to de-emphasize or to isolate America. once an institution, a diplomatic institution begins, it's hard to stop. But there are many former Indian diplomats who doubt the value of the Quad, the quadrilateral security dialogue, the meeting that's been going on for about 10 years or so between the United States of America, Australia, India, and Japan. But it's likely to continue. But without overturning the Quad, without spoiling the party, without being a rude guest, Australia could make subtle changes in its foreign policy rather than gang up with Japan and America on India and pressure it to, put sanctions on Russia. Maybe Australia could side with India and demand an awful lot more from America. If America really wants to be a genuine equal partner in the Indo-Pacific, perhaps it needs to learn to talk with more respect to the largest country on earth. Fifth point of my 10-point plan to pivot from Washington to Delhi, for Australia to pivot from Washington to Delhi, is that Australia, could initiate the establishment of a new multilateral organisation, which I'm just going to call the Littoral or Coastal Eurasia Cooperation Organisation. The Shanghai Cooperation Organisation has, over the last, 20 years or so, grown to be a very important trade, diplomatic, even quasi-military or sort of political organisation that integrates the Eurasian economies and resolves conflicts between them and supports major trade and development initiatives between them through a multilateral institution. Australia should stop seeing itself as an outpost of Europe, an outpost of North America. It should see itself as close to what some people call the Yuxi Circle. There's a circle of, a radius of 4,000 kilometres, sort of centred in Myanmar, so in covering China and India and Indonesia, where I think it's 4.8 billion people live, and these are amongst the most important developing economies in the world. Australia is on the rim of that. Rather than try to be America's sub-imperial power, perhaps we should initiate a new multilateral institution that ties together Indonesia, the Philippines, Japan, China, Russia, the Southeast Asian states, Malaysia, etc., and of course India, all part of that great millennial long, that great sort of coastal region of trade and exchange and civilizational interaction that has been vibrant for thousands and thousands of years. Such an organisation might help bridge the growing war between the Eurasian and the Euro-Atlantic worlds, between Atlantis, as in the Atlantic powers, and the world island, as in Eurasia. It could be a source of peace, trade, and major projects, assisting infrastructure and development for billions of people, billions of our neighbours. It could also help all these nations prepare for the eventual, hopefully peaceful, withdrawal of America from the Western Pacific. The sixth point of my 10-point plan for Australia to pivot from Washington to Delhi is to increase naval and defence and, more broadly, I guess, economic cooperation with India. Now, I'm no expert on defence, and I can only assume that we would have at least some options for greater security collaboration with India. Indeed, that India might also be able to help us with our defence and security relationship with China. After all, India is a neighbour of China. It borders China. Point number 7 of my plan to pivot from Washington to Delhi, for Australia to pivot from Washington to Delhi, is that Australia should change its position on Ukraine and NATO, the European security arrangements established by NATO to support the Indian position. How powerful would that be if Australia in the diplomatic world said before the United Nations that what Europe is doing and what America is doing is unconscionable, that it is driving Ukraine to ruin, and that the real path to the resolution of this conflict is genuine dialogue and diplomacy that respects the proposals Russia put in 2021 about a long-term resolution of European security arrangements. That, after all, is also broadly what China will be backing as well. Why don't we help make a difference to peace in the world and do that, and then follow that path of neutrality, being open to dialogue and diplomacy with everyone. I think Narendra Modi was asked by the Australian newspaper just before his visit to Sydney last week, this whole question, or why is India, it was a bad-mannered, rude sort of question about how dare India have this neutral position on the conflict in Ukraine, and Narendra Modi said quite firmly and politely that being friends means we can understand everyone's position. It keeps open the talk of dialogue. Australia could learn a hell of a lot from that, because after all, Russia is a Pacific power. The 8th point on my plan to pivot from Washington to Delhi is to propose changes to the United Nations Security Council to get behind India's plans to reform the United Nations Security Council. Again, a country like Australia that has long been part of the Western camp, firmly saying that, all the dithering and the procrastination and the false proposals from the West are no longer acceptable. It's essential that the United Nations Security Council establish real substantial changes in the membership and operation of the UN Security Council. It's well beyond time to rearrange the key council of global governance to reflect the realities of the multipolar world, rather than the American dominance of a shattered world devastated by World War II in 1945 or 1946, when the UN began. India has a clear objective to join this council as a permanent member, and I think Australia should absolutely really push hard to make that happen, and also to get others involved. In my personal opinion, I think the other NATO powers, Britain and France, so long as NATO continues to exist, should not be on the United Nations Security Council. There should not be free powers from one so-called defensive alliance on a Security Council forming the majority that is stacking the decks, and Britain and France simply do not have the claims of international significance in the new multipolar world. There needs to be a restructured UN Security Council and also changes in how it works. The ninth point of my plan, 10-point plan, the ninth point of my 10-point plan to pivot from Washington, for Australia to pivot from Washington to Delhi, is that Australia, as part of its proposals to reform the UN Security Council and reform the United Nations, should propose rebasing the United Nations and multiple international organisations in India. America should no longer be the home of the United Nations. It should go to a country with a longer and deeper and more meaningful tradition of genuine diplomacy. America's history is a history of war. All but 17 years of its entire existence as an independent state, it has been at war. And that warlike nature has increased in frequency. The number of wars America has been involved in has increased in frequency since 1989. It is scandalous that the United Nations is based in America. It is scandalous that America should, as it did recently, refuse visas to the Russian foreign minister until the very last minute so that he could participate in chairing the United Nations Security Council as he was scheduled to do. America has simply disqualified itself, and the recent comments from Senator Lindsey Graham, I think, just adds to that the shameful record of America in international diplomacy. I think it is time to move the United Nations headquarters to India. So not just Australia, but the whole world can pivot to Delhi and to the Yuxi Circle, the great centre of population, economic development and cultural dynamism that is Eurasia. And then finally, the 10th point in my plan for how Australia can pivot from Washington to Delhi is that Australia should leave AUKUS, the Australian, British and American, whatever it is, defensive alliance. It should abandon its plan to spend $385 billion on subsidising American nuclear submarines, and it should oppose the British plans for a blue Pacific that reactivate the old, rather unfree and unopened Indo-Pacific of British imperial heritage. More than that, I think Australia should actively discuss with America a timetable for withdrawal of US forces from the Western Pacific, including Taiwan, Japan, Philippines, and the Australian bases. We might even, in Australia, think about whether, through Pine Gap and our participation in the Five Eyes, whether we really want to be part of the Five Eyes of this American god of war. hopefully Australia's participation in all those bases will not drag this small country of 25 million into a catastrophic world war, to restore American influence in the world, to assert the independence of Taiwan, even though it's contrary to Australian and most countries around the world's policy. I think it's time for Australia to put an end to these Anglo-American fantasies, to end AUKUS, to end the nuclear submarine deal, to end neo-colonial forms of the Indo-Pacific, and to focus our participation in defence and international diplomacy on genuine actions of defence of our national interest and the global good, rather than defence of American hegemony, the protection of a declining American empire. Now, there are no doubt other opportunities. Some of these things might be wildly unrealistic, but I think the debate in Australia, maybe even the debate in India, is getting to a point where we need to get beyond slapping each other on the back and saying Modi is the boss, and talk about real action that will advance a different kind of multipolar world in which Australia and India are real partners in a truly free and fair multipolar world. I'm going to have to call an end to the live stream there. Thank you all so much. Thank you for the questions from Adventure Time. And do leave us a comment. Comment below. And I'll respond to those over time. I do like to respond to the various comments I get on my videos on the YouTube channel. I'll probably release sections of this live stream as separate videos as well. Give it a like. Why don't you subscribe as well? And if you're interested in what I have to say, what you can also do is go in your web browser to jeffrich.substack.com, and you can sign up there for my free weekly newsletter, Glimpses of the Multipolar World. And there you can also upgrade your subscription and get some extra content from me on a fortnightly basis. I've just started a series of fortnightly articles talking about the crisis of the multipolar, the current poly crisis, some people even call it, of the world today, the great world crisis that we're all so worried about, and exploring that over 8 or so articles. So it's really great value. I think it's $7 to $10 Australian per month. So if you would like to support me, that's a great way to do it. And if you subscribe to my weekly newsletter, you'll get all the information about all my content, including my books, my videos, my podcasts, and even some of my random jottings on Twitter. Thanks everyone for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this live stream. I hope you like the 10-point plan for Australia to pivot from Washington to Delhi. Why don't you leave me a comment? Why don't you suggest some other points that Australia could take to be a genuine partner for India in a free and open multipolar world? And in the meantime, I'll be back next Tuesday with another live stream, possibly talking about this great concept of the poly crisis, the world crisis that we're all going through right now. Bye now.